morning. On September 23rd of 1952, Richard Nixon spoke to the American public on national television to address allegations presented against him. No one knew that his speech would be a turning point in the world of media and politics. Nixon was running for the position of vice president, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was running for the position of president of the United States. Nixon was accused of illegally accepting funds from donors, which brought fear to the eyes of the voters. Nixon decided it was time to stand up to these accusations and deliver a speech on national television, which is now known as the Checker speech. The broadcast was viewed by 60 million viewers and was the largest television audience in history at that time. The question must be asked, why did this event alter the world of media and politics? While this speech was only 30 minutes long, the impact has echoed throughout history. Through research and study, it has become clear that this speech has altered history because of three reasons. First, the political candidate had an authentic message. Second, there was no longer a middleman between the candidate and the audience. And third, the media and the candidate displayed honesty. The Checker speech was the first of its kind. 1952 was the first year that the political parties' conventions would appear on television along with 30-second advertisements of the political candidates. Therefore, both the audience and the candidate were new at understanding how television affected the world of politics. Nixon took advantage of the lack of expertise in this field and made himself seem extremely authentic. Kevin Mattson, a professor of contemporary history and expert on the Checker speech, explained Richard Nixon would engage in an existential act of self-definition by going in front of cameras and baring his soul. He would plead his case and make the audience see him as an ordinary guy. Nixon had to connect to become sincere and authentic for the lonely crowd watching his image in living rooms. In the current stage of culture, a lot of society believes that everything on television is staged. I'm sure there are many of you in the crowd today. These people do not believe that authenticity is possible via the media, and sadly, they have rightfully gained that reputation. However, the Checker speech was clearly designed to make Richard Nixon look extremely authentic. This cannot be denied. He was filmed in a living room setting which made him seem like an average person. His wife was peacefully sitting in the corner of the room like a normal American housewife. And Nixon also mentions a family dog his family received as a gift. The dog's name was Checkers, which eventually gave name to the speech. The dog represented the normal American household with children who desired the love of a pet. However, while the set and situation was made to be viewed as authentic, Nixon was also authentic with his message. In Nixon's memoir, entitled In the Arena, he remembers the moments leading up to the Checker speech. He writes, "I worked non-stop with very little sleep during those days. Many times I found that my best ideas had come when I thought I could not work for another minute and had to drive myself to finish the task before the deadline." While Nixon's stage was made to look authentic, he also poured his heart and time into the message he wanted to be conveyed. Nixon was also extremely nervous about conveying the message to the public. Just minutes before the speech, he told his wife that he would be unable to go on air and deliver his message. However, his wife assured him that he could complete this scary task. Nixon would later give credit to his wife for the completion of the speech. Nixon's nervousness displayed his need for the message to be portrayed accurately. One can alter a setting to appear authentic. However, the candidate used the media to display the authenticity of his message. The authentic message was able to be conveyed because there was not a middleman between the candidate and the audience. When someone reads a news article, the writer is the middleman between the events and the audience's perception of the events. However, Nixon was speaking directly to the audience. He was using his own language to affect the society. Lee Humner, a professor of media and public affairs at George Washington University, writes, "Underlying these decisions was a concept still new to the television era. For this speech, the camera would not be a journalistic instrument, looking in upon an event and conveying the story to the public. For the first time, a national television audience would participate directly in a living room to living room encounter. He goes on to later write, it would be Nixon alone with the people. The reporters and the politicians, his own staff and Eisenhower's, would all watch on television, and none of them knew what he was going to say. While the media could alter the setting and the space in which the broadcast was captured, they could not alter the fact that Nixon was given the opportunity to speak to 60 million people without a middleman. It is important for one to consider the way in which society used to gain information. The newspaper was a main way of gaining information back in that time. However, newspapers were controlled by a middleman. The writer, editor, and owner of a paper had the power to infuse their bias into the message. This is very common in today's media, and especially political media. However, the Checker speech was new in the idea that a middleman was not infusing a bias. Society was hearing the message from the source of the message. Huebner writes again, television was a way to do an end run around the press and the political establishment. Nixon had found a way to avoid the middleman. He gave America the opportunity to hear his message for what he wanted it to be perceived as. The beauty of the Nixon broadcasting speech was that he controlled the person he wanted to be perceived as. Once again, this is not Nixon trying to trick the American public. He is simply using the media in the best way possible without being unethical. Last, this speech was extremely successful in altering the media because Nixon displayed honesty. It is interesting to consider the Checker speech in light of the Watergate scandal, which forced the presidential resignation in 1974. I'm sure many of you have already had this cross your mind as I'm presenting. After Nixon was vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower, he became president of the United States in 1969. He was considered very successful in foreign affairs and was rather loved by the American people. Nixon decided to run for president again in 1972 when his first term was finished. It was found that his campaign had broken into the Democratic National Convention at the Watergate Hotel in order to set wiretapes and steal classified papers. Nixon and the White House denied any involvement in this situation, and he won the presidency in 1972. However, it was later discovered that Nixon was involved in the scandal, and he resigned from the office in 1974. Therefore, it makes one curious as to why Nixon would not learn from the success of his honesty in the Checker speech when covering up his involvement in the Watergate scandal. America's approval of the Checker speech and Nixon's resignation over the Watergate scandal both display the importance of honesty in the media. Nixon's Checker speech was a success because he used the media to speak honestly and directly with the American people. He was not speaking on television to cover up his actions, but rather to address any possible involvements with the problem. Nixon opened his broadcast by stating, "My fellow Americans, I come to you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity have been questioned." One can doubt his authentic personality. However, Nixon displayed humility, which was rare for the American public to see via the media. Yet it is sad that he broke his own principle years down the road, which cost him the presidency. The Nixon broadcast did not alter the media because he talked about the funds, but because Nixon made himself an honest human. Lee Huebner writes again, perhaps most interestingly, the address foreshadowed the emergence of a new conservative populism in America, emphasizing appeals to social and cultural identity rather than economic interests. This speech was regarding misappropriated funds handled by Nixon. Yet Nixon turned the problem into an opportunity to use the media in order to display the honesty and authenticity of a political figure. Nixon was no longer a talking head begging for votes. He became a real and honest human who was worried not only about his votes, but also about his integrity. When Richard Nixon stepped in front of the camera on September 23rd, 1952, no one knew the impact the speech would have on American media. Nixon's career would be full of many ups and downs. Sadly, he is remembered by many people because of the Watergate scandal. However, he changed the world of media because of his Checker speech and the influence which came with it. The speech was successful because of his authentic message, his avoidance of the media middleman, and his honesty. These three simple characteristics of Nixon's Checker speech helped change the world of media and made this moment last in history. Thank you.
So did he, Mr. misappropriate the funds?
Did he misappropriate the
In
funds?
other words, was this just him getting up and saying, of course I did not, and being...
Well, in light of the Watergate scandal, that's been questioned more and more of whether or not.
Yeah, I wondered if you found anything.
According to things that are found, no, he did not.
He did not,
He
okay.
did not.
Josh, you said you spoke for 30 minutes, right?
Mhm.
Wouldn't that be a very long speech?
If you think of it as a TV segment, I mean, usually TV segments you think of like hour-long or something. But in regards to how the impact that the speech had in history, I mean, it is a little bit long, but
Mm.
Do you know if there were commercials, or was it him for 30 minutes?
I believe it was him for 30 minutes.
Well, you must have had a lot to say.
That would be interesting nowadays with our very, very
Yeah.
short attention
Right.
span. People would change channels.
And I think the reason I think that it was captured is because it was the first thing of its kind too.
Mhm.
People were like,
Yeah.
"What is this?" And it was they were so curious as to what this entailed. And, yeah.
So, are there any stats on the number of stations nationally then? How many TV stations were there?
That carried it.
Yep. I mean, the existing, this was in the early days of television.
Correct.
We didn't have television stations everywhere.
Correct.
Even then, he had 14 million people watching him.
60 million.
Six,
60.
Yeah.
60.
Whoa, wow. So that makes one all the more curious as to how many TV stations there were
Not carrying the speech. You're saying in total.
in total.
I do not know that stat. No.
Yeah.
Joshua, it's interesting, you said the media writer infuses a bias. So the media writing major, have you infused a bias into your speech?
Into this speech, I would say yes. I would say everyone comes with a bias, and it's important to address that bias. And
What do you think is your bias?
I think my bias is I tend to believe in people maybe more than I should, and I like to believe that he was telling the truth. And I think that would be my bias coming into this is maybe I give him more benefit of the doubt than I should, but that would be my bias, yeah.
And you like his dog?
I did like his dog, yes.
The Nixon family would be very happy to hear that you're speaking here this morning.
Josh, can you on the fly give us your thoughts on how Donald Trump has
Wow.
basically used these principles?
Or not?
Would you like me to?
Yeah, I would. No, I'm serious.
I think he successfully was very honest with what he believed, and I think it was showed in his election, and he stepped up to the podiums in many debates and just shared what he thought, and I think that showed itself in the results of the election.
And what about the use of social media?
Yeah, I would say that was a big part of it as well, yeah.
I was going to ask about the content of the speech, because you kept coming back to this idea of authenticity and honesty. As far as the content of the speech, what did he deliver that made people think that he was authentic and honest? And I ask this question because most people think that he kind of avoided the charges. He didn't really prove that he didn't do it. He just kind of went on to something else. So how did he communicate that idea of
I think
authenticity and honesty?
I think he did try and avoid it a touch by talking about, okay, this is my wife in the corner, this is my nice dog, this is the living room, I'm just like you, to make himself be perceived as authentic and just an honest American person, while, okay, yeah, I didn't take the funds, kind of say that and brush over it, while making the situation around him be perceived as authentic. I think a lot of people bought it.
I'm curious, and I know you may have not looked at this, but how interesting, excuse me, that you're saying that he used the media so well and he changed the media with this speech, and then later in his debate with Kennedy, that whoever his handlers were at that time were not aware of how to use the media. So how such two very different situations.
That was the most interesting part. I didn't get to research the Watergate scandal as much as I wanted to because that wasn't my main focus. But that was the most interesting thing of like the fact that he went so far the other direction of being able to completely get away from what he was doing in the Checkers speech and ended up costing the presidency, which was crazy turnaround for sure.
Right, but then when he debated Kennedy, when Nixon was running for president, that is used as such an example of that Kennedy's people understood the media
Right.
and Nixon did not.
Exactly.
And here his people seem to
Yeah.
understand it with this, and then they didn't carry it through and make sure he was well rested and they made up and all those things that we
Right.
talk about now
Makes
with
him
that,
the
but
biggest
anyway,
fighter ever.
very fascinating.
He was good at faking sincerity.